What's going on YouTube? Wada here, and today we are here to talk about really obnoxious drumroll introductions.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
Bravely Default 2. Bravely Default 2 is a Square Enix RPG that has a huge focus on classic, old school JRPG vibes. From the music to the combat to the character design. This game is a callback and a love letter basically to the old school generation RPGs. If you know anything about me, you know this game is right up my alley. What I think happened is that Square Enix wanted to mix a little bit of Final Fantasy 3 and 5 and 9 all together, and this is kind of what came out. But hey, that's just a theory. A game theory. Now, some people are going to be confused about the title, it being called Bravely Default 2. You don't actually need to play Bravely Default 1, as that was a completely different storyline and completely different characters. This is kind of like a spiritual successor, just basically the same mechanics. Bravely Default 1 did have a sequel. I believe it was called Bravely Default 2nd. So yes, those two are the 1 and 2, part 1 and part 2. But this game has nothing to do with those other two. As I said, just the same mechanics and same style of game. So firstly, I want to talk about the combat. So let's just jump right into it. Now, a little disclaimer, there are two different modes to play this game on. So you can play on hard mode or you can play on casual. And hard mode is pretty hard, but I think if you are a fan of these types of RPGs, then hard mode does bring quite a good challenge, and it's extremely fun to play on. You have to really play on the type of enemy you're fighting and really think about your strategies going into battles. The gameplay is your classic turn-based RPG with a few added elements that kind of let you play the game in a more dynamic fashion. You control 4 characters where you run around on an overworld map where there are, wait for it, no random enemy encounters. Battles can also be sped up to 4 times speed, which really helps. It keeps the game from getting too grindy at any point. And I just believe being able to speed up the battle is kind of a necessity in modern day RPGs. Monsters have your classic weaknesses to different elements, so fire versus ice, light versus dark. So it's pretty basic there, but there are, however, a couple more weaknesses that can be exploited. So certain monsters and enemies might be strong or weak to specific types of weapons. So you really got to think about what elements you're using, but then you also got to think about which weapon types you're using in your battles also. This just adds another layer on top of already a pretty interesting battle system that we'll get deeper into. Another layer to the battles is the Brave and Default system. I'm just here eating a layer sandwich. Each character has the ability to Brave, which will allow you to borrow against turns or BP to allow you to use more than one action per turn. If you have 0 BP, as I said, you can borrow against future turns, but you got to be careful here because let's say you borrow up to 4 BP, when that will put you into the negative, you won't be able to act for 4 turns. But it might be really important to use those 4 turns. Let's say everyone else in your party is dead and you need to revive all 3 and then get maybe a Curaga spell on your party to get everyone back to full health. So the BP and the Brave system is quite imperative in these battles. Now, to gain BP, you can default, which it's basically just another term for guarding. So you can guard and it will increase your BP by 1. So you won't actually do an action other than lower the amount of damage you take for your next turn. This makes for an incredibly versatile way to take on each battle and each boss. Planning when and how to spend your BP can be the difference in winning those 30 to 45 minute boss battles where maybe you had the wrong jobs equipped, maybe you had the wrong weapons equipped, and let's just say you haven't saved in over like 3 hours, and it causes you to lose so much progress, and you just get so angry, and you break your controller. This is part of a D-pad from a Switch controller that got broken in a totally unrelated way.
Got him!
Turns come up for each character based on their speed, so instead of issuing all of your character commands at one time and letting that play out, each character turn will be very individualized. So I really like that based on a character's stats. So it definitely feels like you're playing 4 separate characters. So alongside the main story quests, there are also side quests throughout the world, and there is a day and night system. So depending on when you enter a town, if it's daytime or nighttime, that can affect which quests are actually available to you at the time. Some quests are your classic fetch quests, and others are quests that will take you to fight rare monsters that might have some pretty gnarly weapon drops. Did I just say gnarly? There's also a sleep mode kind of functionality. It's kind of online, but what it basically does is whenever your Switch is in sleep mode, your characters will be off exploring, and you can get extra experience items or stat items based off that. And I think that's a pretty cool concept also. So my favorite part about this game, and one of my favorite RPG mechanics of all time, is the job system. Now, Bravely Default 2 does this beautifully. They don't do anything groundbreaking. They just flesh this out so well, and they just do it justice. There are 24 separate job classes. You'll find majority of these just going through the main story. There are a couple you can miss though, but depending on if you finish the game or not, you're most likely going to get all of the jobs. Now for me, it's so incredibly satisfying to level up each of your job classes and kind of give different roles to different characters. It's not necessary at all, but again, I think it just adds to that role-playing experience and lets you play the game the way that you want to play it. It also gives you a bunch of different ways to kind of tackle bosses and enemies. If you are struggling, rather than having to grind and just level up, you can also tinker with your jobs and your abilities and see if you can beat the enemies that way. So each character is able to equip a main job and a sub job. Now, depending on which job class you have equipped, it's also going to determine what stats your characters have and what items and armor they're able to equip. So some jobs you'll be able to equip much heavier items and armor and weapons, and some jobs you won't be able to equip as much. So again, just another way to keep your characters kind of custom and separate, which is good to always have that individuality. Now, some of the stats that aren't in most other RPGs, and I think they do it pretty well here, is the weight stat, as I just mentioned, but also the chance to be targeted stat. So depending on what weapons or items you have equipped, you might have your character have a higher chance of being targeted. So let's just say, for example, you have a glass cannon type build. Depending on what types of weapons and armor you put on them, the enemies might be going after that character quite a bit. So again, it just adds another layer on how you're trying to build your characters. Now, the reason I don't really mind the weight stat, because it does keep you from just being able to put on whatever weapon, whatever armor you want on each character. The reason it doesn't bother me too bad is because your weight stat does increase with your character level. So it kind of just keeps you from equipping the most powerful item you come across at the very beginning when you get to a new town. So it's not too big of an inconvenience, and you can just grind if you want to do that. But it does let you be a bit more creative if you just want to go ahead with the story and not worry about grinding too much. So we should probably talk about the story next. They don't really do anything special here. I believe it's the weakest part of the game. Now, that's not to say the story is bad. It's just the same story we've seen over and over, thousands and thousands of times.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Not that story, but it is your basic 4 heroes of light looking for the crystals, trying to get to the 4 crystals before the baddies get to them. Again, it is pretty basic, but it is a direct correlation to those Final Fantasy games I mentioned earlier, and it is the same company. It is still Squaresoft, Square Enix, that made this game. And I think it fits. I think it works with this style of game. There are, however, a few twists, and there are some kind of dark elements that really caught me by surprise. So it's different enough and intriguing enough to not get in the way. The story is paced really well, so you never feel like you're being bogged down by the narrative. Also, the way they do the cutscenes in this game I really like, because the characters are voice acted, but the voice acting can be skipped through without skipping the whole cutscene. So you can read ahead and you can just skip one line of dialogue if you like. So you can kind of rush through, or you can slow down and go at your own pace. There are also multiple endings to the game, which they can all be unlocked in one playthrough, but that means you are going to see the credits roll approximately 4 times if you get all of the endings. So it's kind of annoying. Getting into the characters, the 4 main characters are Seth, Gloria, Elvis, and Adele. Each of them has their moment in the game. They each have their own time to shine, and it kind of just unfolds as the story unfolds. So again, like I said, one thing this game does really well is the pacing. So you never feel like you're stuck with one character or chasing one narrative the whole time. It just kind of unfolds pretty naturally. There are also quite a few boss characters, and again, they are kind of your classic villains, your classic tropes, but because there's so many, most of these bosses are the ones that are holding your asterisks, which are what give you your job classes. So they're kind of unique to the job class. And as I said, there's some really twisted and really dark stories here. So overall, most of them are your cookie cutter builds and your cookie cutter villains, but they all have kind of their unique story, and they're not necessarily good versus evil. There's kind of a little bit of an in-between and ambiguity there, and I think more games should do that. It doesn't have to just be one villain or one hero. I kind of like when there's a lot more going on. It makes the world feel a little bit more immersive. The graphics are great for a JRPG, and the character models are pretty good and pretty unique, especially as you're switching to different jobs with each character. Each town and area has its own kind of distinct look, and the game is pretty vibrant overall. During the cutscenes, you will see the backgrounds, that will be on display, and then your characters will be front and center. Some of these backgrounds are 3D, some of them are 2D. I know it sounds really weird, but hopefully I can put some examples up for you. It actually works quite well, and I thought this was an amazing design choice. I want to see more games in the future kind of take this model. Now, the soundtrack is also very good and very enjoyable. Again, anyone that knows me knows that I love a good soundtrack in an RPG. So if a game does have a good soundtrack, I'm going to get lost in it, and I'm going to sink a ton of time into it. This game does such a good job at fitting the soundtrack to the characters, fitting the soundtrack to the moments, fitting it also to the overworld themes. There is some dynamic changes with the music, which I had never really been introduced to this until Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I guess I just never paid attention to it in other games. But Bravely Default 2 has this, where there might be one overworld theme playing, and when you walk into a new area, the track continues to play, but it does change maybe the instruments that are playing, or the tempo might slow down or speed up, depending on where you are. And I just think that's such a cool design choice. And again, sometimes I've found myself just walking around just to hear the music playing. So I absolutely loved everything about this game. I clocked in at just over 80 hours, and I got all of the endings. And when I finished, the only thing I wanted was more Bravely Default 2. Also, being able to play this type of game on the Switch in portable mode, I think is amazing. So if you're like me and you travel a lot, so I do travel, I fly in airplanes a lot. Being able to play this game on the go and just turn it on, turn it off, just pick up and go, I think it's so cool. And this is the perfect type of game to play that way. So I highly recommend this game, and I can't wait for more games to come out just like this one. Now, in my previous video, I did get some advice and some feedback, and a lot of people seem to think I do need a rating system so that they know kind of where I'm ranking these games and if they should give it a try. So we're going to try something today. I guess Bravely Default 2, I would probably give it, I guess, I don't know, 8 watermelon slices, I don't know, out of 10 watermelon slices. See, it's a work in progress. Don't get hung up on that.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine, and you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because
Please don't unsubscribe. I'm sorry.